All right, let's get down to some other content. First, I thought I would talk to you about this reaction that I've gotten on Twitter from some of my followers who apparently were surprised or displeased that I'm speaking with you because apparently you are a regressive that needs to be corrected. Where is this coming from? Because I haven't picked it up. In all the times that you have graciously invited me on your show, I thought you were very reasonable, very serious guy. I didn't pick up any ostrich-like thinking. So what are they thinking about when they are levying this accusation at you?
So you're saying accusations were made on Twitter, but they were not substantiated?
That is true.
Okay. I find that shocking. No, I don't know what they were referring to. I mean, you would have to ask them, I guess. I get criticized for criticizing the regressive left, which I now consider more the authoritarian left, I think is more sort of relevant and less misused. And I also get criticized for being part of the so-called regressive left. So I don't know. I mean, I get accused of being a Zionist shill and a defender of Muslim terror as well. So this is not new, I guess.
I was really surprised to see this exchange David Pakman had with Gad Saad. I never considered him to be anything but morally honest and fair. On any subject, he calls things as he sees them. He's not concerned with whether he's going to anger people on one side or another. And as he mentioned, David Pakman mentions all the time, he usually gets attacked by both sides, on the left and the right. I see him as taking a very balanced approach to these sensitive issues, the social justice warrior and authoritarian left. And right now, I'm going to show clips from his show as an example of that. But the first one, he pretty much clearly sums up the whole concept of the authoritarian left in this next clip.
We've talked about the so-called regressive left with you in the past, and one of the primary critiques of this concept is that it's just a pretense to criticize Islam or feminism and things like university safe spaces. And there's no doubt that those examples do come up, but in reality, the concept is an attempt to illustrate a larger authoritarian tendency among some on the left. To some, the term regressive left has become totally toxic and worthless, and I totally get that. So we can even set aside the term and talk about authoritarian leftism instead. The bigger picture is the phenomenon of supposed progressives using right-wing means of communicating and controlling people, and how left-wing authoritarianism is very distinct from real progressivism. It's not progressive to use right-wing means like censorship and us versus them rhetoric to neutralize bad ideas or promote progressivism. Using authoritarianism to enforce progressivism is a sort of paradox. Authoritarian leftists act as though the end result justify any means. If someone is, quote, progressive, they're automatically and morally and rationally in the clear and entitled to use whatever methods they deem necessary to advance their goals. These authoritarians use the progressive brand as a sort of facade to attract people who have an inclination towards progressivism, like the inherent values of benevolence and self-consciousness, and they use their supposed monopoly on progressivism to enforce their agendas. But many people are ending up being blind to this process because they're caught up in the righteousness that they feel from their association with a centralized set of beliefs and tactics. This defies the values of individualism, which is basic to progressivism, the idea of upholding personal independence and free agency. To that point, one of the most prevalent and innate facets of the authoritarian left is identity politics. It's also a foundational precursor for a lot of other manifestations of authoritarians on the left.
In this next clip, David Pakman is addressing identity politics and his being attacked for criticizing a movement. Now, it's really odd that this happens when you see suburban, middle-class white people speaking up. They somehow have been designated the spokesperson for minorities, and they speak for them. And when you criticize those minorities, then they attack you, but they somehow you don't have the right to criticize, and yet they can speak on their behalf rather than letting people speak on their own behalves as human beings. Anyway, here's the next clip.
Putting aside for a second that I'm a Hispanic immigrant to this country whose second language is Spanish, right? Let's put that aside, because if people perceive me to be white, then certainly I could be the beneficiary of white privilege. I'm very much aware of that. I don't know whether attaching the term white privilege to my commentaries really makes sense. And I think the angle is, look at David sitting there suggesting that obviously any movement that seeks to activate around black issues and black rights has a rich white guy behind it. I think, Lewis, if I'm to interpret the criticism as accurately as possible, that's the critique, that it's offensive to say, of course, any black rights movement has just rich white people as the puppet masters behind it, which could not be further from what I was saying.
In this next clip, David addresses the Black Lives Matter connection to the Israel BDS movement, and he picks apart the movement, the absurdity of the claims of the BDS movement.
Black Lives Matter put out a letter, a platform, effectively, and it includes support of the Israeli BDS movement. This is a platform which, in addition to calling for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israel, it called Israel an apartheid state. It says that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians, and it said that the fight of Black Lives Matter for Black American equality in the U.S. is the same as the fight for Palestinian rights. I've told you before that Black Lives Matter was hinting at drawing parallels between their battle and what they see as the situation in Israel. And I've told you it makes no sense empirically, nor from an optics point of view, to be perfectly honest. They have jumped full speed ahead. Now, I know that when you hear support BDS, end colonialism, end the genocide, stop the apartheid, it sounds like a lot. Wow, that's a really overpowering case. What if we break it down into its component parts? Well, you quickly see that it makes absolutely no sense. Let's start with apartheid, right? Black Lives Matter's platform, for whatever reason they've decided, it points out that Israel is an apartheid state. Now, of course, apartheid, we know, Lewis, is a policy of segregating and both economically and politically oppressing groups of people based on race or ethnicity. Typically, historically, it is done against the non-white population. South Africa is a common example of this. This is factually untrue when it comes to its existence in Israel. Israeli citizens have the same rights regardless of their ethnicity, religion, or race, period. Now, people will hear me and they'll say, David, what about what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank? The people there have different rules, so it is apartheid. There is no doubt that Palestinian movement between Gaza and the West Bank and what I guess we would call sovereign Israel is heavily regulated. But those territories are governed by the elected Palestinian Authority and Hamas leaders. There is no comparison to a state of apartheid like the one in South Africa that is typically referred to. It is a total lack of credibility to say, oh, Israel's an apartheid state. You know very little if that's what you think.
Yes, you just don't know what apartheid means. Israel has had Palestinian elected officials. So please tell me how that's apartheid, please.
Here he addresses the sheer absurdity of he's now a white supremacist because he criticizes a movement.
There have been instances where, while I am, of course, supportive of that, I issue individual critiques of actions, specific actions taken under the supposed umbrella of Black Lives Matter. And although I feel that I am being 90 to 95% sort of positive with a 5 to 10% critique of a specific tactic or whatever, I've been called everything up to and including a white supremacist for having the audacity to issue any critique of the movement.
Here's David with a fair and reasonable criticism of a Black Lives Matter protest at a library.
Let's talk about Black Lives Matter. Protesters at Dartmouth University, Black Lives Matter protesters disrupted students who appeared to just be studying in a quiet library. They reportedly were hurling profanity at white students and physically pushing others. Here's just a little bit of the video from this Black Lives Matter protest in a quiet library.
Black Lives Matter! 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 Black lives matter. Black lives matter. Black lives matter. Black lives matter. Black lives matter.
All right, that gives us a sense of what's going on. So reportedly, some of the protesters were also saying, F you, you filthy white Fs. F you and your comfort. F you, you racist S's. One of the protesters posted online that they were ashamed of what the protest turned into. So even some of those who initially thought this was a good idea, saying that they were very displeased with what this turned into. Louis, I've made it very clear. I support almost all of the goals of Black Lives Matter. I agree with Black Lives Matter with regard to the problems in society that they have pointed out. But what will they achieve by protesting a quiet library? I don't get it. This will get attention. I don't think it's attention that will catalyze credibility. I don't think it's attention that will catalyze change. Who am I to give advice, though? And every time I talk about this, people email me. They say, David, you're not black. You can't comment on this. Your comments are irrelevant. Fine, then ignore my comments. But these are my comments, and I do not understand what is going on here.
Here's a rather poignant example David brings up of a protest of race-based discrimination at University of California, Berkeley. A protest of race-based discrimination using race-based discrimination. Oh my.
I want to talk about a story I did yesterday where I told you about students at the University of California, Berkeley, had a day of protest to demand the creation of additional safe spaces for transgender and not white students. And during the protest, I told you yesterday that there was a sort of human chain formed, which was used to prevent white and some Asian students from getting to class, but they would interrupt the human chain to allow Black and Hispanic students to get to class. There has been a sort of counter narrative to this now, which argues that it wasn't actually that white students were being blocked and non-white students were being allowed. The position is that everybody was being blocked from getting to class except for students with disabilities. But the reason that it looked like the chain was interrupted for the non-white students is because the non-white students were actually joining the chain, the human chain, as opposed to just trying to get through it and go to class. Others have emailed me saying, David, this is damage control. And it's obvious from the video that those non-white students being let through the chain were not joining. They were just going to class. I sort of think it's not the most relevant thing. You know, yesterday when we talked about this, Rachel, I pointed out that it's sort of ironic to use a sort of race-based discrimination to protest race-based discrimination. But I think the bigger picture is to discuss, what is this protest meant to achieve? And number two, is this approach likely to bring about the change that protesters want? And I think that's really the key question, where I know not everybody in the audience agrees with me on this. I don't see this type of protest achieving anything, particularly when 75% of the incoming freshman class last year at UC Berkeley was already not white.
For this next clip, David and Louis pull off the gloves and they tell it the way it is regarding this sickening interruption of a Pride Memorial service. The most sickening aspect of this is that the hundreds, it looked like hundreds of people, you can't see it in this video, but hundreds of people that were there actually stood up for this, actually let this happen. That is really, but David takes them to task for it. He and Louis really expose them.
This Monday, there was a vigil planned at the University of Missouri to honor the victims of the horrific mass shooting on Sunday at Orlando's club Pulse. And it essentially turned into a blame session against the University of Missouri's LGBT community for not being intersectional enough and not paying enough attention to the fact that the overwhelming majority of the victims were also Hispanic in addition to being gay. Some Latino activists, including a University of Missouri official, scolded what they described and may have been a mostly white gathering for focusing only on the LGBT identity of the victims and ignoring, as they said, the Latino background of the victims. Okay, I'm going to play some of the video for you. This is, I think this is pretty bad. And this is Tiffany Malecchio chastising the crowd. And let's play it and then I'll talk about it.
I was really nervous to get up here because there's a lot of white people in the crowd. And that wasn't a joke. I wish this many people came out to our racial demonstrations and our Black Lives Matter movement.
Come on. How are you?
Okay.
Well, I don't want to stand up here and be angry because this isn't for me and this isn't for you. It's for the people that we lost and the people we may lose tomorrow and the people we lost yesterday. But I thought I'd take the moment to just like list out some facts that many of you probably don't know because you're white. I'm tired of the black and white dichotomy that happens every time we talk about race or anything that goes on in our country.
This is just, I mean, we could spend a couple hours on this.
Yeah.
I'm Hispanic, and while I'm not gay, I'm supportive of the LGBT community. What's wrong with recognizing the LGBT component here? I mean, we know that the shooting was motivated by hatred for gay people. There's no evidence it was motivated by hatred for Hispanic people. So that's sort of at the base level. But that doesn't mean we should ignore that most of the victims are Hispanic. But should we interrupt an LGBT organized vigil? No, this is productive in no way. Nothing that this young woman says is illegitimate per se. But the implication is, hold on a second. The implication is, because you are white people, you care more about LGBT than you do about racial issues. I don't know that she has any basis for that claim whatsoever. And she's sort of getting into this ranking of oppression that sometimes happens on the left, which is completely arbitrary, right? And a great example is Jews. Jews are an ultra minority, kicked out of countries all over the world for thousands of years. They rank very low on the left's oppression and discrimination scale, right? And this is an example of what we're seeing. Wait a second. Why are we all focused on LGBT? Hispanic is more oppressed, and thus this rally organized by the LGBT groups is in some way insensitive to the racial background of many of the victims. This is truly toxic.
This is one of the most obnoxious people I've ever heard in my life. And the words I want to use to describe her, I can't use.
Right.
Because we just can't, FCC, we can't use them. That's how I feel, really. Just to stand up there and say, well, you white people, you probably have no idea what I'm talking about because you're white.
It's scolding.
You might not know about these papers I have here and these numbers because you're white. You're all bad people because you didn't come to BLM things instead. Instead you're at this vigil. It's so obnoxious. And first of all, when you start off a speech that way,
who are you going to win over?
Right, exactly.
David tackles this issue of the New Year's Eve attacks in Cologne, Germany earlier this year. And at the end of last year, the hypocrisy of the regressive left and the feminists for their stance on people in the West, white people, etc. I'm putting words in mouth. He didn't actually say this, but when it comes to the misogyny and the hatred of females by the religion of Islam, we're not condemning all Muslims, but it's in the Quran, it's in their Sharia law. And when it comes to that, the feminists and the regressives they're a protected species. They can't be criticized. And you'll see how he addresses this. Like I said, I'm putting some of this in my own words, but I really appreciated how David handled this subject.
Now, some regressives have come out and done and said things that make absolutely no sense. After the attacks in Cologne, Germany on New Year's Eve, we talked about how it was a very widespread in terms of media coverage, that the background of the men was not mentioned. And then we started seeing all sorts of strange comments come out. Now, our friend Dave Rubin from Rubin Report over on Aura TV, he found a few instances of sort of very regressive comments, and I want to outline them for you here. At the top of the list is one we already covered, which is that the mayor of Cologne, Germany, had this code of conduct released, which was mostly focused on what the women should be doing, what the victims should be doing. And while we talked about this, Lewis, there's a difference between sort of practical advice about how to be cautious and bordering on victim blaming. And we already talked about how many of the elements of that code of conduct made no sense. Like, for example, keep strangers at arm's length away from you in crowds in public, right? Some elements of that made absolutely no sense. Dave talked about that. We talked about that. But there are other examples that Dave Rubin pointed out in a really great article. He pointed to a tweet, Lewis, from self-described feminist Lori Penny, presumably a progressive, I don't really know. She tweeted something out truly reminiscent of the right. She said, quote, "So bored of racists who only pretend to care about women's rights when they see an opportunity to bash Muslims." This is straight out of the right-wing playbook, almost alluding to sort of concern trolling, because you can criticize Muslims by reporting the story. This is akin to when right-wingers say, oh, the left is racist for seeing racism. This is the left saying someone claiming to care about women's rights is racist because the perpetrators appear to be Muslim. This is absolutely regressive, and we have to watch out for stuff like this, Lewis. This is not good. This is exactly what Majid Nawaz is saying we should not be doing.
In this next video from the David Pakman show, David takes on this made-up mental disorder, Islamophobia, and accusations of racism when you criticize an ideology. He makes it easy to understand how the regressive left has it wrong, how it's okay to have opinions about an ideology.
Many, if not most of those who are progressive and also criticize Islam are just as liberal on foreign policy as any other progressive. When it comes to Islam, calling a spade is not synonymous with neoconservatism the way that many want to claim. Criticism of Islam does not need to lead to drone strikes or nuclear war. Islamism and Western militarism are both right-wing concepts that need to be picked apart by progressives.
And so what I mean by the regressive left is this phenomenon of people on the left wing of the debate who see between their duty, their ideological duty to challenge, foreign policy mistakes, American and British foreign policy mistakes, so what they interpret as, colonialism and neocolonialism and neoconservatism. Mm-hmm. They see it as their duty to challenge this, and then they see another challenge, which is theocracies and the Islamist ideology. And they have come to the view that you can't challenge both of these together, because if you were to challenge Islamist theocracy, you're supporting neoconservative foreign policy.
And maybe you're a liberal who's thinking, okay, fine, so Islam has inspired some bad things, but why would you be so focused on it? There are no practical implications. There's no way to productively use these notions in the real world. Well, not only would you be wrong for a number of reasons to which we would need to dedicate an entire separate segment, but you've also just more or less admitted that you have ulterior motives that are influencing what you're willing to say about Islam. Here is the fundamental fallacious assumption on which a lot of regressives are operating. Holding Islam to the same standard that we hold religions like Christianity by default leads to right-wing foreign policy, therefore Islam is completely benign. This statement makes no sense. Regressives, a lot of the time, make conversations about religion and ideas for conversations about foreign policy or the pragmatics of intercultural relations. A discourse about how outsiders can productively interact with Muslims is totally distinct from a candid conversation about the ethics and influence of the Quran. The fact that someone like Sam Harris would be ineffective as a communicator to most of the Muslim world does not invalidate his observations about Islam. Islam must be reformed from within, but we can't allow our fear of offending Muslims to show the skewing of our perception of reality when it comes to religious dogma. If I were to point out to you that misogyny exists in the world and some of it is because of Islam, what sense would it make for you to respond and tell me that I'm discounting or ignoring Muslim feminists, or that I'm insulting Muslims, or that I'm affirming secular dictatorships? It wouldn't be true, nor would it even be relevant. Absolutely, there are right and wrong moves when it comes to collaborating with the Muslim world in order to defeat terrorism and theocracy. But that has no bearing on what is or is not true about the Quran and psychology.
And next is a video clip of David Pakman talking with Dave Rubin about the regressive left. And Dave Rubin remarked that Dave Pakman had been out in front of this subject. He had recognized it early on and had been talking about it, which is the reason I'm making this video compilation, to show how David Pakman has a grasp of this whole issue of, he calls it the authoritarian left as opposed to the regressive left. But this is a really telling, very fruitful exchange between the two Daves.
Dave, you know, I continue to be sort of saddened by the response from so-called progressives when I talk about some issues of pretty significant political importance. Obviously, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one where you and I have talked before about the sort of disconnect that exists between self-described progressives and not really standing up for what we would think of as progressive values. Another example I've been seeing in the context of our elections in Argentina. I saw this after the passing of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, which is a very negative reaction to my pointing out that sometimes what sounds like populist rhetoric is really sort of corrupt, plutocratic policy disguised as populist rhetoric, and I'm disappointed there as well. What do you think is fundamentally sort of under the foundation of this disconnect between progressives and progressive values on some issues?
Yeah, well, first, let me start, Pac-Man, by saying that you really were ahead of this. You know, I think I was ahead of this in some ways because me and you started really talking about this split and this strange lack of truth, and that narrative was more important than fact. All of this stuff that we now see consistently out of the progressives, or as I now refer to them, the regressives,
Sure.
Which is a phrase coined by Majid Nawaz, who I've had on my show. Majid Nawaz, a Muslim trying to reform Islam, so they don't like him. As a matter of fact, some on the left call him a porch monkey because he's sitting with Sam Harris. I mean, think of the absurdity of this type of discussion that we're having. If someone on the right did that, they'd all be going bonkers and want that person fired. But if it comes from the left, then it's okay that this Muslim guy, this brown guy, is a porch monkey. It's insane. So there's a lot here, and the reason I mentioned that you were ahead of it is not just to pat you on the back, is to say that this has been coming for a long time. This split has been coming. People are waking up in huge numbers, and it's not just you and it's not just me. I did Joe Rogan's podcast yesterday. The reaction has been incredible because people are starting to get it, that we have to stand for basic principles, regardless of where they are and who they are and the color of the people that do it and the sex and all of that. So what was your original, what was the exact question?
What I'm trying to figure out is, what do you think is underlying this confusion, as I like to call it? I mean, I don't think it's anything, it's out of malice or hate or anything. I just think it's a fundamental confusion. What is underlying it?
Okay, so I think it's a lot of things. I think what I've realized about the regressives in general is that they believe in narrative over fact. So in many cases, facts just simply don't matter. So in any case that involves something racial, or especially if it involves Israel, or if it involves anything involving women or anyone that they deem to be the other, but it's deemed by them to be the other, they don't care what the facts are. They care about the narrative of it, and they want to slam that narrative home no matter what, and only talk about stories that fit their narrative and ignore stories that don't fit their narrative.
David takes a question from a viewer regarding the potential split in the progressive liberal left of liberals and social justice warriors, what the future holds, and these are his opinions of what the future might be.
Last question today is from Twitter, from a user named Wizard of Cause. The question is, will the division between social justice warriors and liberals result in the long-term evolution of new factions? The answer is maybe. There is this division happening between so-called social justice warriors and so-called liberals. And even the term liberal is somewhat getting mixed up. Are we talking about a classical liberal, which is really more like a libertarian? Are we talking about a modern liberal, which really we're talking about a progressive? The split that is happening ideologically within the American left, I think the next 5 to 10 years will determine whether this becomes a sort of permanent rift or not. But I like to think of it the way that libertarianism is no doubt distinct from neoconservatism. There is no doubt about it. However, most libertarians tend to vote, generally speaking, for conservative Republican candidates and mostly focus on what they perceive to be fiscal conservatism and small government ideas, sort of disagreeing with the social ideas of many right-wingers. So while there is, we can definitely distinguish, Lewis, today between a libertarian and a neoconservative. The Libertarian Party, while it exists, and we now see Gary Johnson with a third-party candidacy, it has not really grown nationally in a way that is totally distinct from the Republican Party, although the ideas certainly are different. In the same way, currently, and for the foreseeable future, the next 2 to 4 years, I don't believe that the split between social justice warriors, for just to use the term of the questioner, and more traditional progressives will lead to actually different voting patterns, because ultimately they're both going to end up more likely than not voting for the Democrat in the election. Over a longer period of time, I think it will depend. It's possible that they may split into factions, but will they really separate in terms of voting blocks? I don't know. Probably not if we stay with a two-party system.
I've made this video compilation as a tribute to David Pakman and the work he's been doing for a long time, speaking out against subjects that many of us feel strongly about, and seeing, more importantly, being fair and seeing what is right and what is wrong. David Pakman is news. We watch and listen to it for news, but it's also opinion. You have to remember it's opinion. So these are his opinions. And I happen to agree with most of his opinions. David Pakman is on the left. He is a liberal, but he sees the destructive force of the regressive, or he calls it authoritarian left, the social justice warriors, which is, he points out in the last video, is a pejorative, and how it will potentially split the liberals. Although he doesn't feel politically we will all be voting for the same people, and the people on the right will be voting for the same people, whatever the splits are. But anyway, this is a tribute to David Pakman and his insight onto this subject. Thank you for watching this video. Please click the links to the videos below that were used in this, and please support David Pakman. Watch or listen to his show. Thank you very much. Please subscribe to this channel if you like the videos.